Welcome to Bishop Barron Presents. I'm Jared Zimmer, the Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute. And in this episode, Bishop Barron sits down with Dr. Robert George, one of the premier intellectuals in America today. In this conversation, they talk about natural law, the woke phenomenon, and how we can ingrain virtue in society today. So sit back and enjoy. All right, Professor George, wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jared.
Yeah, I've been a fan of your work for a long time, and I've really been looking forward to this conversation. So thank you again for being here.
I've been looking forward to it, too. I'm a big admirer of this guy, so it's great to be together with him.
Yeah,
Appreciate
wonderful.
that.
Bishop,
Thanks.
of course, always great to be with you.
Thanks, Jared.
As well. I thought one place we could start, and of course you've been talking about this for a long time, is the area of natural law. And maybe to kind of start off, what is the kind of state of natural law right now? I mean, it seems like it's being attacked on all sides, but is that really the case kind of on the ground?
Well, the natural law is what it is. It's the moral law insofar as we can know it by the operation of our reasons, by the use of our intellect, even apart from any special revelation in Scripture, for example. The natural law is the body of norms and principles directing us toward certain ends or goods as things that are worth having for their own sake, and away from the privations of those things. So toward friendship and away from whatever undermines friendship, toward the pursuit of intellectual knowledge, away from ignorance and falsehoods, and so forth. And then the moral norms that we identify as principles of natural law are norms that are basically determinations of the overall directiveness or integral directiveness or prescriptiveness of the basic reasons that we have for action that are provided by the basic goods to which our intellects direct us.
I think that the term prescription is important here, right? There's a difference between description and prescription. But what might be that difference there?
Well, description is an account of the world as it is, whether we like it or not. It's not normative. It doesn't say do this or do that. It just describes reality quite apart from any direction that we might receive with respect to it. Prescription is normative. When I say, Sally, clean your room, you as a father probably are accustomed to saying that. That's not a description of the world. Yeah. It might presuppose a descriptive truth about the room. It's pretty messy right now. But you've now prescribed. You've now said to Sally, you need to do something. You need to clean up your room.
Bishop, what has been the relationship between the church and natural law?
Well, church, of course, has adopted it, used it. Think of someone like Thomas Aquinas, who would take all those principles that Professor George is talking about and also ground them in the eternal law, which is identical to the mind of God, and then would see natural law as a kind of bridge between the eternal law of God and then the positive laws that we make in society. They're just in the measure that they reflect the natural law, which in turn reflects the divine law. And so the church has seen it for a long time as really integral. What I find in my work, especially with younger people, the state of natural law, I think, is perilous because the dominance of a subjectivism. I determine the meaning of my life. It's up to me. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what to think. It's my ego. It's my freedom. My will determines. Natural law draws us out of ourselves. I love that about it. It's like the objectively, aesthetically good. You know, when you hear Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, that draws you out of your own little, egocentric preoccupations. When you see a very fine moral act, someone reads the story of Maximilian Kolbe, that draws you out of your sense of, well, here's what I think life's all about. That challenges your ego. So I think that's the problem we're facing, is the challenge we're facing, is people have a hard time accepting the objectivity of intellectual norms, aesthetic norms, and moral norms. But those are the things that make life worth living. I find when you're stuck in that little cramped world of your own ego and your own expectations, ho-hum, right? But the best things in life draw you up out of yourself. That's where I think the natural law plays a very important role in the spiritual order of things.
The great proponent, the great advocate of natural law thinking in our own time is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
In his letter from Birmingham jail, he tells us that the difference between a just and an unjust human law is that a just law is in line with the natural law as well as the law of God, whereas an unjust law is out of whack, out of sync with the natural law. King is very clear here that by natural law, he means what Thomas Aquinas means, what all the great figures in the tradition mean, and that is the moral law accessible to us through the use of our intellects. Natural law is a matter of reason. The basic attack on natural law from subjectivism is the idea that we can't reason about anything. Reason can't tell us what to want. It can only tell us how to get whatever we happen to want. Reason is reduced to a purely instrumental role, as in the philosophy, for example, of David Hume or Thomas Hobbes. But for believers in natural law, Martin Luther King, Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic Church, non-Catholics, not just King, of course, who was a Baptist, but from the Jewish tradition, for example, Rabbi David Novak, all the great theorists of natural law believe that reason and not merely will is what directs us toward our ends. The subjectivist believes I should just go with my will, with my desires, with my passions, with my feelings, and none of that can be subjected to rational scrutiny. But as with King, in distinguishing just from unjust laws, the natural law theorist says, no, wait a minute. What you want, what you feel, your desires, all of them are subject to rational evaluation. The human intellect has the power to distinguish good from bad, right from wrong. It can correct our feelings and desires if we're willing to follow the path of reason.
Do you find this, I use it as a strategy sometimes, is when it comes to something that you take seriously, you stop being a subjectivist or a relativist pretty quickly. What I mean is, you want to play golf better, right? Now, everyone swings the golf club in a somewhat unique way, that's true. But there are very clear objectivities about the golf swing. There are certain things you have to do properly or it's not going to work. And if you're serious about it, you want to get better at golf, you stop being a subjectivist. Oh, just swing any way you want to. No, you're very happy to subject yourself to the laws of the golf swing. We're both guitar players. You're a lot better than I am. But when I first started, sure, everyone's got his own style. But there were all sorts of laws of guitar playing that I had to subject myself to. There are disciplines and practices. I wasn't a subjectivist. So just do whatever you want with that thing. So I think when you take something seriously, you rejoice in the objectivity of it. And so you start taking the moral life seriously. You don't want to live in the space of just do whatever you want or follow your own private whim. You stop being a voluntarist and a subjectivist when you start taking it seriously. So like the joy of the moral life, I think, is what we have to introduce young people to, the thrill, the adventure of it. Subjectivism is a very boring little, small, clean, well-lighted space. Open them to now the wonders of the objective order. I think that's the challenge.
Bishop Barron used the term voluntarism as something that we as natural law proponents reject. Voluntarism is just the idea that the will in the end determines everything. It's the will that matters. And the will is not under the governance of reason. Reason has no power to direct it. Reason, rather, is the slave of the will. In Hume's famous line, the slave of the passions that can pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. This is the fundamental divide in thought about ethics. There are many different schools of ethics, but I think the most fundamental divide is between those who think that will is what is paramount and ultimately controls everything that we do, and those that think that reason has governing authority over will.
Look at Nietzsche's will to power, so the dominance of that strain of voluntarism. Also someone like Sigmund Freud, who would say, that finally reason is just in service of the id and its basic desires. So it's a reversal of Plato. Reason is kind of governing the passions. It's the charioteer. Passions are great. They give a lot of energy to your life. They're like the horses. But reason is the charioteer. But that's been reversed in many ways. The charioteer's been kicked out, and the horses are running amok. Might be a way to see what's going on today.
This reminds us, Bishop's point here reminds us, that the natural law tradition does not begin with Catholicism.
Yeah, that's right.
If we look at the ancients, if we look at Plato, and especially Aristotle, if we look at Cicero and the other Roman jurists, we see wonderful articulations of the basic ideas of natural law theory. It's not a distinctively Christian, much less distinctively Catholic thing.
Now, how much of that is influenced by revelation? I mean, Edmund Burke talked about how without God, you really struggle with natural law. So what's the role of revelation in regard to natural law?
Well, Christian natural law theorists and Jewish natural law theorists such as Rabbi Novak have always held that natural law does not displace God's role, nor does it mean that we have nothing to learn about the moral life from Scripture, from God's revelation of His will. It's probably best described in Pauline terms. Because our reason is fallen, because our reason is fallible, because we can easily make mistakes, we can suppose we're being guided by reason when actually we're not. We can discern the moral truth through our reason, and we should do everything we can to do that, but we're going to see it somewhat darkly. We're going to see it somewhat in shadows. We do the best we can, but we're not going to see it anything near perfectly. What God's revelation does is cast a light, a spotlight on the situation. It doesn't displace the need for rational inquiry, deliberation, understanding, judgment in making our choices. But it gives us data, it gives us information that goes beyond what we can know simply by reason itself, particularly, it seems to me, Bishop Barron, in the domain of our own vocations, in our own personal lives. There are lots of morally great things that any particular individual could do with his or her life, fully in line with the principles of natural law, fully in line with the principles of morality and justice. I can be a banker, I can be a lawyer, I can be a medical doctor, I can be a scientist. But what religion then brings is the question, but what am I being called to do? What's the mission being given to me? What is my vocation? And at least as Catholics understand it, the vocation is not just the question, should I be a priest or be a layman? There is, of course, the priestly vocation, but the concept of a vocation goes well beyond that. One has a vocation, for example, you and I do, to the married life. I have one to scholarship, to teaching. These are things that we discern not by abstract reasoning about natural law and justice, but by meditation, prayer, sacrifice, fasting, trying to discern God's particular will for us.
I would draw attention too, Jared, to the rich young man, because Aquinas would identify the Ten Commandments as basically the same as the principles of the natural law. So when Jesus says to the rich young man, well, what about the commandments? Well, I followed all those from my youth. Yeah. Good. Well, there's the natural law. There's the foundation of the moral life. But now Jesus says to him, if you really want to get serious about it, can you sell all you have and come follow me? So it's a dimension that I think Cicero and Aristotle and company wouldn't have sensed. So we're not despising in any way the natural law, we're accepting it. But then there is a dimension beyond it, which I think is opened up by the incarnation, opened up by the invitation into a radical gift of self, Yeah. So it's similar to the play between philosophy and theology, across our great tradition. Thomas talks about a monoduxio, a leading by the hand. So philosophy can bring you to a certain point, but then you open yourself to revelation. Something I think analogous in the moral order too obtains.
And Professor George, you've been a proponent of what's now being called kind of this new natural law theory. Think of John Finnis and Gryzik and a few of the others. What makes it new? What makes it kind of unique?
I don't think it's all that new. Okay. I think the label is a bit of a misnomer. I think what it does is it captures and restates, rearticulates a basic insight that we get in Thomas Aquinas, squarely within the portion of the Summa Theologia known as the treatise on law. And this is where Thomas asks the question, is there simply one basic principle of practical reason, or are there many basic principles of practical reason? And Aquinas resolves that question by saying there are, in fact, many. So then the question is, well, what are they? And the answer to that question, and we who are the so-called new natural law theorists put a lot of emphasis on this, the many principles of practical reason correspond to the many different reasons for action, reasons for choice and action that we have, directing us toward things that are worthwhile for their own sakes and not merely as means to other things. I cited earlier the example of friendship. We want friendship, we want to be friends, we want to have friends, we want to be good friends to our friends, not merely for instrumental reasons, to get asked to the best parties, to get a good job, to get to know people with influence who can help us in various ways. although those may be additional benefits of friendship. But the most basic reason for pursuing friendship is for the intrinsic value of friendship itself. It's not merely a means to other ends. In fact, a friendship that was only about means to other ends, that was nothing more than means to other, wouldn't be a friendship at all. But friendship isn't the only basic human good, the only more than merely instrumental reason for choice and action. So just as there is a basic principle of practical reason directing us toward the goal of friendship and away from the things that undermine friendship, there are basic principles of practical reason directing us to other ends. The appreciation of beautiful form, for example. The pursuit of intellectual knowledge in any of the various fields in which we pursue knowledge, in the natural sciences, in the humanities, in the social sciences, in our everyday lives as we are curious about this or that or the other thing and devise strategies for figuring out in fact what the truth of the matter is about it, and then operating on those strategies, executing those strategies, and moving from ignorance or error to truth. And there are many others. What we so-called new natural law theorists hold is what I believe Aquinas pretty clearly held, which is that we grasp those first principles of practical reason, directing us toward what is intelligibly worthwhile for its own sake, choice-worthy for its own sake, and away from their privations. We grasp them not by deducing them from anything else, from facts about the world or facts about human nature, considered just as descriptive matters, but rather by the intellectual act of grasping the point, seeing the point of the activity. My grandmother, who was not well educated, who only got an elementary school education, knew perfectly well that friendship provided a reason for action that didn't require any deeper or further ulterior reason for its intelligibility. She wouldn't have put it that way, but she understood that perfectly well. And that's not because she did a descriptive study of human nature, comparative cultures, and found that friendship is provided for in some way or another in every culture. No, it's because in the experience of friendship, beginning when she was a little girl, she grasped the intelligible point of the thing. Now, those basic human goods, those basic reasons for action that are the objects of the first principles of practical reason, according to Aquinas, those are not themselves moral norms. That's another point stressed by the so-called new natural law theorists. It's true, we grasp friendship as a human good, but that leaves us with a lot of questions. For example, would it be right for me, would it be morally acceptable for me to tell a lie to protect a friend? Now, if the answer to that question is no, which I believe it is no, the Catholic Church teaches it is no. If the answer is no, you mustn't lie even to protect the reputation of a friend. That means that simply noting that friendship is a basic human good doesn't resolve the question. So we need to move from the first principles of practical reason to the question, what considered integrally do they mean for situations of morally significant choosing, whether to tell a lie to protect the reputation of a friend? And we who are so-called new natural law theorists believe that if you examine the first principles of practical reason as a whole, if you look to their integral directiveness or prescriptivity, you will be able to identify principles of right and wrong, specifically moral principles that will guide us when we face those choices. For example, the principle that we should do unto others as we be done by them. It's articulated by Jesus. It's also articulated in many of the great religious traditions of the world apart from Christianity. But we think it's rationally graspable as an implication of the integral directiveness of those first principles of practical reason, directing our choosing toward what is intelligibly worthwhile. Same with the so-called Pauline principle that we should never do evil, even that good might come of it. It's this principle that's our basis for rejecting that school of philosophy known as utilitarianism, which says simply the right thing to do is whatever will have the best consequences. There are no absolute rules for right and wrong, just whatever in the particular circumstances you're in will produce the most good. You can do that if it means telling a lie, if it means killing an innocent person, if you can still do more good by doing that apparently bad thing, you should go ahead and do that. And we think that's true all the way down to the more specific moral norms such as do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, and even to the most specific norms that we apply in particular situations like don't hit your sister. Those are all specifications of the integral directiveness of the human good.
Yeah, and what would you say is the role of the conscience in that regard? How the intellect and the conscience kind of interact?
Now here, Jared, we need to really be careful to avoid a bad mistake that people are prone to. I don't know if we can blame the cartoon, but the cartoon exemplifies the mistake. It's the cartoon with the little Jiminy Cricket sitting on the shoulder, functioning as the conscience. That's imagining that the conscience is something other than our judgment, our own last best judgment, using the intellect, drawing on the resources, the data of faith and reason to distinguish what I must do from what I must not do, what I may do, and so forth, but reaching the right conclusions about what is required of me morally in the situation that I'm in. We mustn't divide conscience from intellect. If the natural law account of these things is correct, and that's the account that has been embraced by the Catholic Church, if the account is correct, there is no separate thing known as the conscience apart from the practical intellect, apart from the cognitive apparatus that we have for figuring out not only what's true and not true in science or in humanities or in the social sciences, but what's true and not true as a matter of morality, of ethics.
There's so much there to talk about. I go back to Dietrich von Hildebrand a lot, as my listeners know, and his famous distinction between the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. I've always found extremely illuminating, especially today, because there's a tendency to collapse everything into the merely subjectively satisfying. So, I like a particular dish. I like spaghetti and meatballs, but that's something merely subjectively satisfying to me. I would never dream of imposing that on anybody else or saying everyone should like spaghetti and meatballs. But there's a sharp distinction between that and this realm of the objectively valuable. As I read, Finnis and Company, the new natural lawyers, it's a keen sensitivity to that dimension of life. There are certain goods that appear not as simply something that I happen to like or that appeal to my emotions, or they're good in themselves, and they structure my ego. My ego doesn't structure them. They call me out of myself. And then relatedly, the issue of conscience, because so often it's construed, I think, today as some kind of subjective.
Feeling. So
Yeah,
conscience
it's
is how do you feel about
How do you feel about
this?
it? What do you think you should do? It's up to
Wrong.
me, finally. But conscience, as you're quite right in saying, as a rational faculty, is related always to truth. And there's John Paul II on truth and freedom, which is one of his most important contributions, that freedom always has to be correlated to truth. I find true freedom, authentic freedom, in relation to what's authentically good for me, right? So freedom is not just radical self-determination. On the contrary. It's the Servet-Pinckaers distinction, the freedom of indifference. That's sort of a modern sense of freedom. I hover above the yes and no, and I decide on the basis of what? Just my own subjectivity. But for a lot of people today, that's the ideal, that's the norm. But the real thing is what he called freedom for excellence, which is when I become free to speak a language well. So we can all speak English freely. We can say what we need and want to say. Just because we decided to speak any old way, no, because we subjected ourselves to a whole range of beautiful truths and structure and syntax and grammar. The same with swinging a golf club or playing a musical instrument. Freedom is correlated to truth, and I think that's often forgotten in discussions of conscience. But von Hildebrand, we have a kind of an empire of the merely subjectively satisfying. That's the imperial view of things. But the objectively valuable, life, sociability, friendship, religion, all the things that Finnis and Company name, that's what opens up the soul. It's like a seed opening up so that it can really grow and develop when it's exposed to those goods. And a further question, I say it maybe with some self-reproach as a bishop of the church, I think we've been lousy at making that realm of things apparent and beautiful and compelling to people. That we've allowed the culture so to dictate to us this imperialism of subjectivity. That's a failure, I think, on the part of the church and a part of all of us, who believe in this great tradition. Yeah. Why have we been, I think, relatively bad at opening up this world to people? How have we been cowed by a culture that so privileges the subjective? those are more practical concerns that I have as a bishop.
When I was a young man, even when I was a young scholar, it was popular, even in some philosophical circles, for people to say, well, we should respect other people's freedom, their freedom of speech and so forth. We should respect other people's freedom because, after all, there is no moral truth. Truth is merely subjective. It's all a matter of feeling. We claim something is true in the moral domain, but we're really just projecting our emotions. Now, if you think about that even for a few seconds, you should realize there's a big problem with it, which is that it's self-defeating. It's trying to draw a normative judgment. I should respect people's feelings, a prescriptive judgment, from a premise that won't support it. There's no such thing as moral truth. The only way the prescriptive judgment could have any real force is if it's in fact true. And one still hears these days, occasionally at cocktail parties or in freshman philosophy classes, that invocation of moral subjectivism or moral relativism as a ground for freedom. But I think it's fair to say, in professional philosophical circles, even among people who are very liberal in their own moral beliefs, they've abandoned the idea that you can found any view of freedom on moral subjectivity or moral relativism, which then puts the question pretty sharply, okay, if there is moral truth, or at least if we're going to defend freedom, we've got to posit that there's moral truth, then what is in fact the moral truth? And now we're getting to the heart of the matter.
And I think one of the sort of hesitations that happens a lot today is there's this feeling that, and I say feeling specifically, that if I conform to an objective value, to an objective norm, my authentic self is going to have to kind of relegate some of the power over some of the desires that I have. You use a great example of one of my heroes, George Washington, who would hold up the ideal of what he wanted to be, and then would act accordingly along the way until his authenticity kind of became the ideal. But how is it that we can kind of discuss authenticity when it comes to conforming to moral norms?
Well, the idea that true freedom is freedom from moral norms is simply crazy. It means you cannot condemn Hitler. It means you cannot condemn Stalin. It means you cannot condemn the rapist. You cannot condemn the racist. It's crazy. It's like the belief. Here would be an analogy. I'm drawing this from something Bishop Barron said a moment ago. Imagine somebody said, I want to be free in my language. In speaking English, for example, I want to be free from the restraints of grammar and syntax. You would not be able to speak a language.
You've just used them and articulated.
Right, the ability to speak a language requires that you have grammar and syntax. And even in articulating, as Bishop just made this point, even in articulating that view, I want to be free from the requirements of syntax and grammar. You're using syntax and grammar. You're relying on them to make your point. So again, I think it's a question of what the truth is. And to be true to myself, in the end, means to be a seeker of truth in a serious way, and then to live with authenticity and integrity in view of my best judgments as to what the truth, in fact, requires. And what that means is not manipulating or altering my judgments for ulterior reasons, to please other people, to get ahead, to appear to be part of the crowd, to conform to the in-group, and so forth. We Catholics and other Christians and religious believers more generally today, who are now no longer in power, the other side is in power, we are called upon to be authentic in the precise sense of bearing witness where we are under a lot of pressure not to do it, where we're under a lot of pressure not to say what we believe is true, but either to be silent or to say things that make us appear to conform to the norms of whatever the governing ideology of the day, if you call it wokeism or political correctness or secular progressivism or whatever you want to call it.
Let me follow up on that. It's a very important point, I think. I just mentioned maybe priests and bishops, that we bear some blame for maybe not bringing this wonderful world of objective truth forward. But I would say this, too, another failure is the failure to implement the great teaching of Vatican II, which is that lay people are meant to go out into the world as salt and leaven and light, the seculum, right, the secular order is the order of the laity. Great Catholic lawyers, great Catholic politicians, great Catholic writers, great Catholic parents, great Catholic communicators, etc. Not to go out keeping your faith to yourself as a little private hobby, but going out precisely witnessing to these objective values that have transformed our lives. It's not going to happen simply from the preaching of priests and bishops, but by lay people infiltrating the society, you know? And if we allow the fallen culture to take hold, and then we just retreat into privacy, that's a tragedy. And it's not the Vatican II vision at all. On the contrary, Vatican II, bring the lumen to the gentes. Well, that's the responsibility of priests and bishops. That's true in the religious.
Bring the light to the nations, is what Bishop Barron is saying in Latin.
And the light of Christ to the nations, but the lay people have an extraordinary responsibility. Because I can't go into the legal realm the way you can. I can't go into education the way you can. I can't go into communication the way you can. But lay people. So I think you're right, witnessing to these truths, and not just articulating them as we're doing right now, but witnessing in your own life to them. That's what's going to transform the society.
I can't stress this enough to Catholics.
Yeah.
And there's a strong tendency to misunderstand it. You're right. Not only do the laity have a role in what Vatican II calls the sanctification of the world, that is setting things right, that is pursuing justice, the common good, human rights. Not only does the laity have a role alongside the bishops, the Second Vatican Council couldn't be clearer. The laity has the primary role. The bishops don't have the primary role. The clergy doesn't have the primary role. Now, I think a lot of Catholics think back to the days before that teaching was so clear, when there was a misunderstanding. It was never sound, it was never correct, but it was a widely held misunderstanding by bishops and priests as well as by laity, that the bishops were supposed to figure out what should be done in the world and then direct the laity to go out and do it. Now, it's still true that the bishops are meant to proclaim the gospel of Christ. They're meant to teach the principles, but they're not supposed to be telling us what to do. We've got to use our own intellects, our own minds, to figure out how, in fact, to sanctify the world in the sense of making sure that justice is in place, that the common good is genuinely pursued, that human rights are respected, and so forth. So I still to this day will hear Catholics say, why don't the bishops do something? Why don't the bishops do something? And I remind them, hey, wait a minute, you know, maybe the bishops have let the side down on some things, but we've got the primary responsibility, not them. I mean, I'm happy to complain about bishops, don't get me wrong, Bishop Barron, and I've done my share of it.
Need to get it.
But we need, you know, right? I mean, it's the council says we're primary. Okay, let's do it.
Do you agree with me on this, I wonder? I mourn the loss of Catholic action. I knew a lot of priests in Chicago when I was a young guy, newly ordained. I knew some of these priests who were very involved in Catholic action, let's say in the 1950s. The idea there was gather, let's say, physicians and nurses and medical people, read the gospel. The priest who would lead the group would explain the gospel, would preach on it, and then they would do the famous see, judge, and act. What do you see in your part of the world? How do you judge it now in light of the gospel? And what do you do? I've always found that to be a very powerful way to instantiate just this, and I think that influenced the council's teachings. Next week, gather people involved in the legal profession, gather judges and lawyers and so on. Next week, gather people involved in finance and investment. Do the same thing, see, judge, and act. Fulton Sheen writes that book in the 50s, or in the 30s rather, on ecclesiology, the last chapter of which is called Catholic Action. And I think that's the vision we're talking about here of now bring the light to the nations, sanctify the world.
Yeah, I would add, I do agree with that. I would add to it, though, especially in pluralistic societies such as our own, the importance of our working with our Protestant, especially evangelical Protestant friends, our Jewish friends, increasingly our Muslim friends, with whom we agree on so many profound issues of justice and human rights and morality, the sanctity of human life, for example. You know, we should be speaking and acting in unison with them, in harmony with them, and not claiming for ourselves exclusive leadership roles by any means. But the basic insight, see, judge, act, absolutely.
You know, and of course, a very fiery topic today, of course, is Catholic politicians in regard to pro-life issues. What would you say is the role, or maybe the prudent decision, or how we ought to deal with the fact that some Catholic politicians are either for some anti-life issues, especially in regard to abortion, or they at least are privately against it, but they won't publicly make any major decisions.
Well, I certainly think that the primary obligation of bishops, especially ordinaries, is to make sure that the faith is authentically taught and modeled by themselves, by their clergy, and to the extent possible by the laity within their jurisdiction, within their dioceses, for example. And this is not something that the bishops can shirk. It's not a duty that the bishops can shirk. So, quite apart from what the political consequences would be of any particular bishop taking action, for example, to declare that a pro-abortion politician shouldn't receive communion in his diocese, quite apart from what the considerations of politics might be, and in some of those cases it might in a sense backfire and cause greater support for that politician politically. That can't be the bishop's primary concern. The bishop's primary concern is this undermining the faith of the faithful in the diocese of whatever diocese it is? And I think there the answer is going to be very often that, in fact, it is. It's sending a message that this is one possible position compatible with Catholic faith alongside other positions that are compatible with Catholic faith. And very often you have politicians these days, I'm going to name names, Nancy Pelosi, Ted Lieu, who are out there actively saying, I, as a Catholic, am entitled to promote the cause of abortion. That's intolerable. I mean, a bishop, in his role as guardian of the integrity of the faith, has got to speak about that and has got to act. And I think that very often the right thing to do is to call that politician to a meeting, ask for a meeting with that politician. I know Bishop Corleone in San Francisco has requested meetings with Nancy Pelosi. I believe she's declined to have those meetings. But he should meet, if possible, with that politician and instruct that politician that he or she is undermining the faith of the faithful in this diocese. And if they are going to continue to do that, they should not present themselves for communion. I don't see a way out of that. Otherwise, the bishops are tolerating actions, teachings by people invoking their Catholic faith that are undermining the faith of Catholics.
Yeah, there's so much to say there, and you covered a lot of important ground. I think of the declension very quickly from Mario Cuomo, mid-1980s, with the famous speech about I'm privately opposed, but publicly I'm going to support this, to his son. So they both were governors of New York, who just a few years ago was lighting up buildings in New York to celebrate the fact that now abortion laws have become almost completely liberalized. You went in one generation from kind of tortured Mario Cuomo to celebrating, in his son. And that's Thomas More's thing about, when you forsake your private conscience, you lead your people on a very short road to disaster. And I think that's happened. And I think the position of Catholic politicians that you can support this, let's face it, barbaric abortion regime in our country is just untenable. It's intolerable. And so to me, is completely unsupportable, that position. I furthermore agree, and I had the privilege of living on and off with Cardinal George for about 5 years. Mm-hmm. And I was there when he met with some of these Illinois politicians and had that conversation, a very frank conversation with them.
Let me say a little more about it.
Go ahead.
There simply is no principle more fundamental, more foundational to the Catholic understanding of the moral life than the principle of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. We got this in the very first book of the Bible. In fact, the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, the first chapter of Genesis, where we're told that man is made in the very image and likeness of the divine creator and ruler of the universe, the very image and likeness of God. That's what's at stake on all pro-life issues. Whether we will honor the profound, inherent, and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family, whether it's an elderly person facing euthanasia, whether it's a cognitively disabled person who is, quote, allowed to die because we don't think their quality of life is good enough, whether it's an unborn child being subjected to the lethal violence of abortion. It's not the first time we faced that issue in our country. Of course, we have a dreadful history that we're still trying to reckon with. The denial to black people of the profound, inherent, and equal dignity due to them. The issue of slavery, followed by the issue of segregation. In 1962, the Archbishop of New Orleans, Joseph Rummel, faced this question when three prominent Catholic political figures in Louisiana opposed the integration of the Catholic schools, and in fact proposed legislative action that would have impeded desegregation. He couldn't, Bishop Rummel, Archbishop Rummel, couldn't have been clearer. He condemned racism and racist politicians in the most explicit terms, saying that racism and segregation are absolutely incompatible with the principle that we are all children of God, made in His image and likeness, and therefore brothers and sisters. He called upon those politicians to change their ways and stop opposing integration, abandon their segregationist view. When they refused, he excommunicated them. He not only denied them communion, he formally excommunicated them. And guess what happened? Guess what the media reaction was? Guess what the New York Times and the liberal and progressive people said? They said, bravo, Archbishop. You're a hero. You're a prophet. And yet, they sing a different song today when a Catholic bishop does speak out for the profound inherent dignity and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family against abortion or euthanasia. They say, oh, you're crossing the line, separating church and state. Well, how convenient. That's not a song you were singing in 1962.
Well, and furthermore, just recently, the bishops of the United States identified abortion as the preeminent concern that we have. And there was some debate on the floor, at the bishops' meeting. I have zero hesitation in affirming abortion as a preeminent issue. I mean, even as we see, as you quite rightly point out, the link between all these different life issues, and when life is threatened in any way, the church speaks out. But, when 1 million children a year, roughly, innocent children, are killed through the abortion, I have no hesitation saying, yes, that's the preeminent issue we should be concerned about. And so, if, as you say correctly, issues of segregation and racism were seen as very morally serious 1962, a fortiori, the issue of abortion today, it's been the case now since Roe v. Wade, but I think, of course, it's the preeminent issue that we should be concerned about.
And within Catholic circles, some of the kind of movements that's pushing towards this new kind of understanding of integralism, it's starting to try to understand how we participate in sanctifying the world in a different way, maybe a little bit different than kind of the fusionist perspective. But I'd love to hear from you the kind of your idea of the pros and cons of this kind of new integralism movement that's happening right now.
Well, I'm watching and waiting. People who are in the forefront of that movement are writing articles, and I suppose books will be coming out as well, explaining their position. I want to understand it more fully. I certainly share their belief that we as Catholics have an obligation to sanctify the world. I believe that in most cases, these are men and women who are faithful Catholics all the way, including faithful to the teachings of the Second Vatican Council in, for example, the Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, or the Declaration on the non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate. And so long as they are, I'm absolutely fine with that and eager to learn from them what can be learned. I do think, and I hope that they think and trust that they think, that there are certain fundamental civil liberties that need to be jealously protected under our civil law. Freedom of religion being one, freedom of speech being another, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, due process of law, equal protection of the laws. All those are terribly important. I think they cannot be grounded on moral relativism, and I think the advocates of integralism certainly agree with that. They need to be rooted in moral truth. That is, they need to be linked to the goods that they serve and help to secure. For example, the freedom of speech we want in part because it serves the good of truth. The freedom of religion we want because it serves the good of authentic faith, a faith that's not just coerced, a faith that's not just the formal stating of what the church teaches, but the actual belief in it. So long as we're on the same page with that, I'm fine. What I don't want to see is the establishment of a kind of Catholic monarchism. I think this would not be a good road to go down. I think that we're much better off, even from the point of view of the church, much better off with the institutions of the church and the institutions of the state being separated. There are misunderstandings of separation of church and state, but there's a sound understanding of separation of church and state, and according to the sound understanding, which is not the one that removes religion from public life, it's the one that says no one should hold ecclesiastical office in virtue of a political appointment, no one should hold political office in virtue of an ecclesiastical appointment. I think that's important. I don't think it's a good idea in pluralistic societies like the United States to aim or even propose that the ultimate goal is a confessional state. I don't think that would be good for faith, and I don't think it would be good for the polity. So it might be on those issues we disagree, but I'd need to hear more about the specifics of what they have in mind. I'm not in a position where I want to condemn everything that goes under the name integralism. I think we all need to wait and see. These are very intelligent people who are working on this, some very outstanding people. And let's see what the specific proposals are. Let's debate them, argue about them, and see where we all end up.
Yeah, I too am intrigued by that debate going on. There's a lot of, as you say, quite interesting, smart people proposing these ideas. As I read the critics of liberalism, it's that it opens up a religiously neutral public space that really is at least implicitly hostile to religion, that allows religion a certain limited scope, on its own terms, et cetera. And that you see, in fact, in our society, the result of this either marginalization or privatization of religion. And it's the dominance of the liberal, model. So as I read the critics of liberalism, that's what I see. And I think to some degree there's truth to that. As I read you, I wonder if I'm getting this right, that actually the best of liberalism is not so much an external imposition. It's coming up from the heart of the church, that it's principles that are dear to us, as you say. So religious liberty is not something that was imposed upon us, but that comes from our own deepest convictions. Allowing a certain pluralism, and allowing people to come to their own religious convictions without the coercion of the state, well, that's something that comes from our own Christian convictions. And so liberalism at its best, if I'm getting you and others right, is not an external imposition. It's growing from within, from the heart of the church, if you want. And so the church can function happily within that framework. Or even that maybe isn't the right way to put it, like within that framework, because then it sounds like we're being positioned by something. But rather it's compatible very deeply with our own convictions. So I too would share some sympathy with the integralists, especially as they critique some of the moral failings within our liberal society, for sure. I think that's very evident. But the press toward a confessional state, I would see as certainly problematic.
Yeah, that's where I don't want to go.
Yeah.
Now, my first book, the book on the basis of which I got tenure at Princeton, is called Making Men Moral, Civil Liberties, and Public Morality. And I positioned myself in that book as a critic of liberalism, or what in any event at that period of time was taken to be liberalism. It's what the leading liberal political philosophers of the time, John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, and so forth, it's what they believed. Now, by liberalism in that sense, what I meant was the view that has as its central principle the proposition that when it comes to lawmaking, especially constitutional essentials and matters of basic justice, when we're limiting liberty by law, we must never act on the basis of beliefs that we happen to hold about what makes for or detracts from a valuable and morally worthy way of life. We need to be neutral on the question of the human good, neutral on disputed questions of morality. I said in that book that neutrality is, first of all, impossible.
Yeah.
It's illusory. Yeah. Second of all, even if it were possible, it would not be desirable. Yeah. And so I laid out a whole bunch of reasons over several chapters for why I thought it was both undesirable, even if you could get it, but perhaps more importantly, impossible. And that the advocates of that sort of liberalism, although very well-intentioned people and great thinkers, Rawls, for example, the great Harvard philosopher, was a wonderful thinker. Dworkin was one of my own teachers. Although well-intended, nevertheless, they ended up smuggling into their own theories, principles, or ideas about the human good that were formally, by their own strictures, to be excluded. So obviously, it seemed to me, this wasn't going to work. But then in the final chapter of the book, I outlined an alternative ground for the very civil liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, the right of petition the government, and so forth. An alternative theory, a non-liberal theory, one fully compatible with the Catholic position, one that I would think would be attractive to conservatives, whether they are Catholic or not, a foundation, a moral foundation for those civil liberties. If believing in those civil liberties makes you a liberal, my hand goes up, I'm a liberal, right? But my ground for believing in them was nothing like the ground that the great liberal theorists held. In fact, I was among their sharpest, or at least harshest critics.
And what would you say, I mean, you mentioned the term wokeism earlier in our conversation, and I know you've been a champion of good dialogue, and of course your famous conversations with the great Cornel West have been fantastic to watch. But would you say in this kind of wave of this kind of woke theory that's coming out, are there starting to become limitations to that dialogue, or where are we going with this?
Well, this is what's happening on the left, and I think there's a real battle on the left between the woke left and the more traditional left. And the more traditional left is not just one monolithic thing. There's the Marxist left, there's the non-Marxist socialist left. That's a complicated story over there. My beloved friend and brother, Cornel West, is a representative of the non-Marxist old school left. Cornell's the honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America. But that element, those groups on the left that are unwoke, are very concerned about and harshly critical of the woke. Some of the most powerful criticism that has been produced of the so-called 1619 project of Hannah Nicole Jones has been put up on, has been sponsored by the World Socialist website. It was there that James McPherson and so many other of the great historians have made their criticisms of that project. And that project is sort of the epitome of wokeism on the intellectual side. What I would say most fundamentally about it is this. You'll remember Eliade, the great University of Chicago, the Romanian University of Chicago scholar of religion, sociologist of religion, Eliade. And he always taught that human beings are by nature religious. We just are. We're made that way. And we are going to have a religion.
Right.
It's not a question of whether we'll have a religion. We're going to have a religion. The question is, what's that religion going to be? And wokeism is a religion. It's got sacraments and holy days and saints and demons and dogmas. It's a religion. Now, it's a fundamentalist religion. It's an increasingly militant religion. It does not brook disagreement. It's a threat to basic civil liberties, speech, religion, and so forth. It's got to be taken very seriously. It's got to be opposed. It's made enormous inroads into the institutions of culture, including the economy. Woke capital is a big thing now. The woke can command corporations, get them to do their bidding, use their economic power to advance their causes. But what we, I think, need to recognize right up front, if we're gonna do a good job at combating this rather bad religion, is to understand that it is in fact a religion. And you can't beat something with nothing, which means you need an alternative, better, richer, fairer, more just understanding. The woke claim to be for social justice. They are for anything but social justice. We need to give a credible and true account of justice, especially to our young men and women. As a teacher, I can tell you this for sure. They're looking for it. We need to be able to provide it to them if we're going to push back against this illiberal, frankly, extremely illiberal, militant and fundamentalist faith.
My listeners and readers know that I've been talking a lot about this wokeism problem. And, looking at its philosophical roots in people like Marx and Nietzsche and Sartre, and especially, I think, Michel Foucault. And what you find is this deeply antagonistic social theory. Two classes, oppressors and oppressed. And we're going to read all of reality through that lens. Catholic social theory, that's where I agree with you, that we have to propose Catholic social theory as a far better alternative, does not operate out of a kind of oppositional, antagonistic social theory, but a cooperative social theory. Reverse discrimination. I mean, so what you've got in so much of the woke literature is to battle discrimination now, you got to other types of discrimination today and tomorrow. Well, I mean, two wrongs don't make a right. You can't do evil that good might come of it. I mean, all these great principles that we would hold. I'm with everyone from Thomas Jefferson to Martin Luther King, in calling for what often is described now as classical liberalism. Equality of opportunity, not equity of outcome. Equity of outcome is a very dangerous proposition, it seems to me, overlooking the fact that there are hundreds of reasons why there might be, inequity in outcome. Not all of them morally objectionable. Some based simply on our differences in intelligence and courage and get up and go and sometimes just dumb luck or whatever.
Culture.
A lot of reasons why there might be inequities in outcome. When you want to make that happen through the coercive power of the state, that's a very dangerous proposition. But I think in all those ways, wokeism is repugnant to Catholic social teaching, which we ought to be proposing as that very vibrant alternative. But as you suggest, that they have the whip hand when it comes to the academy, it comes to increasingly the economy, certainly communications. So it's a battle. It's a real cultural battle. But we've got the resources within our Catholic tradition to fight it.
We only have a few minutes left here, and I wanted to kind of change gears towards the end of our conversation. I know that both of you have a shared love of Bob Dylan. And so I wanted to ask you, what's your kind of favorite period of Dylan, and maybe what's your favorite song as well?
Well, gosh, this is like choosing among your kids, right? Which kid do you love the most of the gang? I've enjoyed Dylan through really all of his periods. I enjoyed the religious period, the gospel period very much. A lot of Dylan fans look down on that period. They can't make sense of it. But it is great music, that's right, and a great message, actually.
Yeah.
I also like some rather obscure Dylan songs. One that I myself play and perform is this old She Belongs to Me. Do you remember that?
Sure, yeah.
I am not absolutely sure that Dylan himself ever recorded it. I first heard it on an album of all people, Ricky Nelson. Nelson, when he moved from being Ricky Nelson, the pop idol, to being Rick Nelson, the sort of country folk person. She's an artist she don't look back.
No, sure he recorded that,
Yeah, so Rick Nelson included it on one of his albums during his
song.
Dylan period. Tangled Up in Blue, I think is a marvelous song. And some of his raucous numbers, I think, are really good. It Ain't Me, Babe.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, a classic from the early period that I love and also play and perform is Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. It was one of my mother's favorite songs. She made me play it a lot when I was young and just taking up the guitar.
Love that, yeah. I've talked a lot about Bob Dylan. I got into Bob Dylan through Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. So when I heard that in the concert for Bangladesh, I was like 14 years old. And it was one of those things that it was like kicking open a door in my mind. It just opened up this world of the aesthetic in a way. But I love Tangled Up in Blue, too, is one of my favorites. I play whenever I can. Every Grain of Sand, I did a little version of it for Bob Dylan's 80th birthday recently. That's the best of his Christian songs. Visions of Johanna, and Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands, these sort of epic poetic expressions that justifies the awarding of a Nobel Prize to Bob Dylan for sure. So I love all that. Probably Every Grain of Sand, if you push me, I'd say is my favorite Bob Dylan song.
Well, at the end of all of these conversations, I always like to ask the question, based on our conversation, what would you say would be your advice to evangelists today, and kind of how might they really sanctify the world that we've been talking about?
Well, all the virtues are needed at all times and in all places. And there's a unity to the virtues. The great teachers of humanity, from Aristotle to Aquinas and forward, have taught the importance of the unity of the virtues. You can't just abstract one or some out from the others. But at any given point in history, it's usually the case, or in any particular society at any point of history, that there's a particular virtue that is particularly needed, sometimes because it seems to be absent. And that virtue today for us here and now is courage. So I would say to evangelists and also to teachers, I would say to people who aspire for careers in public service, whether it's in elective office or in other sorts of positions, that what you've got to do is muster the courage, first to seek the truth, and then to speak the truth as God gives you to see the truth. The advice that Lincoln gave to the country in that terrible crucible of the Civil War, toward the end, when victory was finally in sight in his second inaugural address, March 5th, I believe it was, in 1865, he gave advice that's still the best advice for us. With the victory in sight, with the preservation of the Union in sight, and now looking ahead to Reconstruction and how we're going to put the nation back together, he said, let us proceed with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. That's my advice. Muster the courage to move forward with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right.
What can I add to that? I think of when I was rector at Mundelein, I supervised the renovation of our students' chapel as the John Paul II chapel, because he had just been, I think at that point he was just beatified, he wasn't a saint yet. But we dedicated the chapel to John Paul II, and I had stained glass windows put in of many of the blesseds and saints that he had, supervised. But over the sanctuary, I've got the two great quotes, and it was in Latin, that John Paul loved. The one was nolite timere, so don't be afraid, and that's your point about courage. Don't be afraid. And the other was duc in altum, right? Go out into the depths. My complaint about subjectivism and relativism and all that stuff, and wokeism is predicated in many ways upon that, is it's playing around in the shallows. We're playing around in the shallows of life. The intellectual values, the aesthetic values, the moral values are what summon us out into the depth. And that takes courage, because it's much easier to be playing around by the seashore. But don't be afraid. Go out into the depth of aesthetic value, intellectual value, moral value. And the church has got to keep summoning people the way John Paul did. That was his great charism. So I think that's what we need today.
All right, well, amen to that. This has been a fantastic conversation, and Dr. George, thank you so much for joining us. Bishop Barron, wonderful as always.
Always a joy.
So, all right.
Thank you,
very
Jared.
much.
Thank you, Bishop.
I'm Dr. Anthony Pagliarini.
I'm Dr. Holly Ordway.
University of
I'm
Notre Dame.
Christopher Kaiser,
Leah
Professor of Philosophy.
Matt Wilson. And I'm
Stacy Trasankos.
Todd Warner. I'm an internal medicine.
Father Stephen Gadbury, priest in the Diocese of
Well, a very special greeting to all the members of the Word on Fire Institute. Good to be back with you.
Today, we're going to be talking about imaginative apologetics. Now, imaginative apologetics is the name of our course overall.
In the coming lessons, we'll be looking at what I call the 4 integral features of the Catholic narrative.
Because this whole series is about how we are to evangelize the culture, and it's that Jesus wants us to go out and not be afraid to do just that.
Newman enumerates the principles of Christianity. Principle of dogma, we've seen.
Teach the literature of the mystical tradition at the Angelicum University.